In this video, I'm going to show you my process on how I approach acoustic live drums. But before we get started, my name is Ed. You're watching Stokes Sounds. And if you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe and leave a comment. And if you want to support the channel, head over to our website, stokessounds.com. Now let's dive in. So I've got some acoustic drums here and I'm going to play you the drums, how they got to me and then what I did with them so you can see a before and after. Let's take a listen. So as you heard there, the drums were a little bit dull, they needed a bit more life to them, and then as you saw, when I applied all the processing, they suddenly kind of came more alive, bigger, wider, and they just overall sounded better to me. The tone of the drum kit as well changed a little bit. So let's actually dive into the individual parts of the drum kit itself, and let's take a look at the processing I used, and not just the plugins that I've used, but why I've done it. So the first one we've got is a kick in. So let's load up the first channel EQ that I've got going on. In this case, it's the Waves SSL E channel. And let's have a listen with it bypassed and then with it on so you can hear what it's doing. So not too much of a difference in this first EQ, but you can see here I'm just taking out some boxiness, adding a little bit more click to it around 4.5k, and I'm using also the expander as well, just to, you know, allow so that there's not so much background noise of the hi-hat and of the snare and everything else, just to kind of isolate it a little bit more. And I've got a high pass filter on. This kind of boxiness sound around here I absolutely despise. I hate it in drums. So I'm going to increase the dB level so you can hear it, and I'm going to take it away so you know exactly what it is that I don't like. You can hear that it just sounds really boxy and just not very musical to me. So that's the first part of the EQ that I did, and then I went in and I did some more EQ, more kind of shaping and taking things away with the FabFilter Pro Q. And this one I kind of use as more of like a, you know, I can visually see the parts of the frequency that I don't like. The channel strip has a sound to it, has characteristics, and this one is kind of a bit more transparent, this EQ, and I'm just taking out frequencies that I just absolutely hate. So if we take a look at what I'm doing here. So as you heard there, I'm just taking out certain frequencies that I just don't like. And again, I've got a high pass filter going on. There is no need to have below 20 hertz in a kick drum because the human ear is 20 to 20,000 hertz. And so all you're doing by having that kind of really low kind of 15 hertz to up to 20 hertz of sub, all you're doing is just eating up headroom, and you're going to struggle to get the track to commercial level. You know, there's a lot of arguments within that, but you know, for just generic reasons, I wanted to do a high pass filter so I could get it up to kind of a generic consumer volume level that seems to be acceptable these days. Next thing I've got is a kick duplicate, and that's because I've used a trigger. So I didn't get a kick out. I may have got a kick out, but I may have taken it out because I didn't like the kick out sound, so I just used a trigger. Now the trigger that I'm using is Slate trigger, and I'm using a couple of triggers, so let's have a listen to what that is. So you can hear there's a lot more punch, there's a lot more attack. With this drum recording, I felt like I didn't really like the kick drums much. You know, I don't know if it was the recording or the kick drum itself, but I just felt like I needed to have some samples in there to give it that kind of pop sound, that commercial sound that I needed. And I just felt that the original kick drum just wasn't hitting it enough for me. And sometimes it's one of those things where you can either try and EQ the real kick drum, the kick in and the kick out, to make it kind of this perfect kick drum. Well, what's perfect, but you get the point. Or you can just say, actually, let's just replace the kick completely or blend a sample in to give us that sound. So again, there's multiple ways of doing this. It's just that I chose to go down this route because it just felt most comfortable to me and I just like doing it. So that was the kick sample that I had, and it looks like I'm just using one of the That Sound country samples, what is it, JJ Kick Shot Fast Medium, and I went to use another one, but the volume is all the way down, so it's just one kick sample. So if we listen to the kick sample together with the original kick we had, You can see it's like day and night on how much better it is with the sampling. So if we take a look at the processing of that sample, I've done a bit of EQ work, again, just kind of massaging the sound to make it fit the drum kit and the previous kick as well. So again, another high pass filter. If we take a look at what I'm boosting, some sub, taking out some boxiness. And some click as well that I felt like didn't really work within the track itself. Again, all these moves would be playing not the drum kit in solo, it'd be playing all together as one and finding what works for the track. So I am soloing just for demonstrational purposes, but when I'm doing these EQs and finding things I don't like, I tend to have everything playing in one go just because it's all about kind of as it sounds as a whole and not as it sounds individually. So that's for that. And then I decided to use some Neutron 4, and I'm just using that as a transient designer just to get a little bit more punch and a little bit more energy on the attack of the kick itself. So it just gives me a little bit more transient. So I'm transient shaping here. Again, very subtle difference, but it's adding to the sound. And then I go into some Spectre and I'm just boosting around 77.5 hertz at this point. So let's see what that's doing. I don't know why I did that. It's funny, when I make these videos, I look back at some of the things I did, and sometimes I'm like, why did I do that? I must have just liked it on the day, and so I rolled with it. Then I've got the snare top, and again the snare top sounded like this. This is the original acoustic kit snare top, so it's not a sample. Snare sounds great to me. Let's use it. First plugin, we got the SSL channel strip again on. It sounds a bit more kind of harder hitting to me with that on, a bit more like a pa kind of sound, and that's kind of what I wanted. I wanted to get the groove of the drum kit, and to me it's kind of that boom boom pa boom boom pa, getting that kind of attack on that snare. So that's helping a lot. Then I'm adding some lo-fi. Who doesn't love lo-fi when you use Pro Tools? I'm just adding a very, very subtle bit of distortion. If we take a listen with it on and off, you'll hear what it's doing. Barely noticeable, but it satisfies me to put that plugin on. Now, I don't always do that, but it adds a little bit of grit and a little bit of dirt to me, so I went with it. Then I've got some EQ on, again, more roll-offs, and there was a frequency up here, 6.4K, that I just didn't like by the looks of it, so let's have a listen to what that's doing. Yeah, again, a bit too sharp to my ear, so I took it off. Then we've got the Spectre again, adding some saturation, and in this case, it looks like I'm just adding some high end, just because I've done so much kind of gating, so much reduction. Now I just need to add a little bit of like the nice frequencies back in to make it sound more pleasant. So let's take a listen with this on and with it off so you can hear what it's doing. Again, very, very subtle stuff. And then after that, we've got the snare bottom. Let's have a listen to what that sounded like raw with no processing on. Sounds great. Good recording that. Again, some EQ, some filtering. Again, taking out some boxiness, some boosting, some high. And that's all we did for that one. So let's have a listen with this plugin on, and with it off, you'll hear what it's doing. Again, quite dramatic what that plugin's doing. I'm doing actually quite a lot more processing than I usually would, but it just felt right at the time with the track, and I think I wanted those drums to kind of be really kind of staccato-y on certain elements, and so that's kind of what it's doing. Then I've got the lo-fi again, adding some more distortion, again adding a little bit more grit, make it sound a bit more kind of rough and a bit nicer to the ear within context of the track. And then I've got some more EQ, and in this case I'd already done quite a large high pass on the channel strip, and so I didn't bother on this one. I just took out 3K-ish. Let's have a listen to that frequency. Again, my ears are very sensitive to around that 3K mark. I tend to reduce quite a lot there. It always just sounds a bit sharp to me. Don't know why, but it just does. Then I've got the trigger, and that's just a that sound snare that sounds like this. Sounds great to me. I've got some EQ going on, taking out some boxiness. Again, very subtle stuff. Then I've got the Spectre EQ lifting up some high end again. Let's have a listen with this on and with it off. Again, very subtle, but it's just adding a little bit of kind of top air to me on the snare drum. So if we just have a listen to the kicks and the snares together with the samples as well. There's not much space going on. It's very kind of tight. Again, very staccato-y in the sense of, there's not a lot of sustain. It's very kind of just boom, cat, boom, that kind of thing going on. And I needed it for this particular song. Again, it's not always the case. Then I decided to take the snare sample and add a tambourine. And I did that via trigger. And I've just got a what sample is it? A tambourine sample of some sort. So let's take a listen with that in. Then I just did some EQ on that, again taking out some low end and kind of sculpting the high end to get it to fit into the track. And then a little bit of a Harlow Vintage Verb. And you can see in a way that tambourine is adding the sustain to the snare drum that I kind of took away from the original snare drum. I kind of pick and choose what layers are going to have sustain, what layers are going to be a little bit kind of have less sustain, and just again kind of try and fit it into context of what else is going on within the track. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but it is so true. Everything is about context and not about what it sounds like on its own. Then we've got the toms below. Now the toms have already been cleaned up. Again, they just sound like this. If I get a tom run, let's just solo the toms on its own. I've just done some standard EQ that I tend to do for toms. They tend to be very similar, always about taking the boxiness out, lifting up the low end, lifting up the high end, again doing some filtering again at the bottom as well. If we take a look at what that's doing to this tom with it on and with it off, you'll see. Again, just adding a little bit of a smoother, nicer tom sound to me. So I've gone with it. And then these are all very similar, these other toms. Again, slightly different tones of toms. So they are kind of adjusted, but again, it's the same principle. Taking out the mid-range, the boxiness, things that I just don't want in the tom, and lifting up the highs and lows. And then we've got the same one here. Again, doing very similar. Now, all of these toms are then bussed out to the CLA drums. I love this plugin, and I've got it on the tom section. And I don't think I did much. I just used a reverb, a little bit of compression, and some EQ. Let's take a listen with this plugin on and with it off on the toms. Let's solo the tom so we can hear just the toms on its own with that on and with it off. So to me, they're just making, the toms sound a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter, and a little bit more in your face. And that's exactly what I wanted. So that was the plugin that I used. And then after that, I've just got some EQ, again, doing some more subtractive and just taking around 4.5K. There was something in there that I just didn't like in context with the other tracks. So if we take a listen to what that frequency was. So it sounds like to me it was like the kind of the stick hit on the skin of the tom, and it would have just been that I felt like it was a little bit too sharp in the mix and I wanted to back that off. So again, I don't always do this on every track, but in this instance I did for whatever reason. It sounded good to my ears, and so I went with it. After the toms, we've then got a ride mic. Sometimes I don't always use a ride mic, I mute it, but for this kind of genre, I wanted to have the cymbals and I wanted to kind of position the drum kit where I wanted it. And the drummer gave me a ride mic. So if the drummer gives me a mic to use, I'll use it. So in that case, we've got the ride. Let's look at the EQ that I did. Again, taking out some low end. I didn't want the room sound of the ride because later on when we look at the overheads, I've got that in the overheads. So taking out all of the bottom end and again, filtering some certain frequencies that I felt like that were too sharp to my ears. So let's take a listen to what that is. I always call those frequencies like they make things sound cheap. And so I wanted the drum kit to sound expensive. And so by taking out kind of the higher end frequencies on certain points, it just kind of molds it into this nice warm kind of sound that I like. So I went with it. And so I took them out. Then after that, we then got the overheads. The overheads came as a left and right mic. I just grouped them together as a stereo bus in Pro Tools. It sounds best to me. I can just process it as one overhead instead of having to copy plugins over. It depends. If I'm using a lot of compression on the overheads, then I will kind of do the left and the right separate, just because the way that the compressors work, it's different if you do it on a separate left and right than a bus. That'll be another video on that, but for this instance it was very generic kind of compression. There wasn't too much going on, and so I just did it on the bus, and it's better for processing anyway. So if we just take a look at the EQ that I use on the overheads, you'll see that I'm taking out some low end again, some more boxiness, and it was a little sharp around 1.6k to 2k, so I took some of that out and I did some compression, but really that's all I did. If we take a listen with this on and with it off, you'll hear the difference. You can see there's barely any compression, and that's why I didn't do it individually. I did it as a stereo. But, you know, you can hear there, it just makes everything a little bit brighter, and, you know, it just sounds a bit kind of, again, more alive, but a bit wider to me as well. Even though I haven't done any widening, it just kind of fills out the space a little bit better. And so that's the EQ approach that I did there. And then I did some more EQ, again, taking out some kind of room sounds that I felt I just really didn't like in the overheads. Looks like I've done quite a lot of subtraction EQ there, but let's just take a look at the frequencies that I didn't like. Yeah, room sound, that kind of woo, just too much of a build in the track with that in. Again, just sharp frequencies that I didn't like. And then I used Soothe this time just because there were certain things that when there was kind of harder hits on the cymbals, again, it was just kind of, maybe my ears were just super sensitive that day, but I just felt like it was just too much. And so the Soothe is like a dynamic EQ. It's just kind of multi-banding those frequencies and just massaging that in to the playing of the drum kit. So if we take a look at what that Soothe is doing. You can see it's just kind of smoothing over the edges of the sharpness of the cymbals, and again it's just kind of creating a nicer tone, a bit like ribbon mics. They always make drum overheads sound really nice and smooth. I don't know what mics were used on these overheads, but they just sounded a bit too sharp for me, and so that's why I use Soothe on the end, just to kind of make them a bit more smooth. Then we've got the room mics. You can see here, again, I'm doing very similar things to the overheads that I'm doing with the rooms. I'm just doing, again, subtle kind of stuff, taking boxiness out. So if we listen with the plugin off and when with it on, you'll hear what it's doing. So you can see there, taking out some mud, taking out some boxiness, adding a little bit of brightness around 10k just to kind of increase the cymbals within the room sound. So when I blend them in with the overheads, it kind of creates a nice kind of cymbal sound, I guess, in context with everything else. And that's all I did there, really. Fast attack on the compression just to control it. I don't like to do too much compression on rooms and overheads, just because when you compress, you bring up all of the cymbals, and sometimes I want to have, you know, there's two ways to look at it. You can have overheads as just as cymbal mics and rooms as just slightly ambience slash just cymbal mics, or you can kind of have them as an overall body of the sound of the drum kit, a more natural way. In this case, I went with a bit more of a natural way, and it just felt right with this track. So that's what I went with for that. And then again, I've done some more EQ, again, kind of shaping the room mic to fit everything else in the drum kit. So if we take a look here at what I've done. Again, just reducing harshness and frequencies that I just didn't like. And then I've got a reverb going on, and I like to do this a lot. I like to add reverb to a room mic. Now, again, this really depends on where the drums are recorded. You know, if they're recorded in a huge studio and they've got a great room sound, then amazing. I'll roll with the natural room sound off those mics. But let's be honest, 9 times out of 10, most recordings are done now in bedrooms, or they're done in kind of smaller studios, and the rooms just aren't as big. And so what I like to do is fake a room on a room. And in this case, I use a drum bright plate. Again, there is no reason why I went with this reverb. You just have to experiment, go through different reverbs, whatever you like, go with. Trust your gut, trust with what you think is right, and that's what I did there. So if we take a listen with this reverb on and with it off, you'll see what it's adding. Now that is adding so much. And you know how earlier on the individual spot mics, you know, the snare mic, the top, the bottom, the kick, it was very kind of, there wasn't a lot of like decay. Now I'm going to get a lot of my decay from the rooms and the overheads. So, you know, there's different ways of looking at how to mix drums and what's right and what's wrong. But in this case and in this instance, I wanted to have a little bit more of a retro sound, and I wanted to have it so that the drums just sounded like they were kind of in a room with one mic recording. And so I used the, you know, the direct mics on the kicks and on the snares as more of like a transient, like an attack. And then the rooms and the overheads created the actual picture of the drum kit. And so a lot of the sustain of the drum kit and what is natural to what you would hear in a person playing a drum kit in front of you is coming from the you know, from those microphones and not from the close mics. Again, that will change depending on the track, but in this instance I did. This rooms up, that would have been a mixed thing at the end where I felt like I wanted to increase the rooms instead of increasing it on the track. I wanted to do it on an aux just so I didn't mess up my levels within the individual tracks itself. Just a workflow thing. And then it looks like I've added a sample crash and a sample ride in certain sections. So if we just take a listen to what the crash sounds like, that's just a sample and the ride. So that's, you know, the drummer kind of doing that. And then if we look at the EQs, very, very standard EQ, taking out the low end, reducing some brightness. Now that is a funny looking EQ. I don't know what I did there. Let's take a look. Right, there was some ringiness on the ride sample that I really didn't like that day, so I took it out. So if we take a listen with that crash sample and the ride sample within the drum kit itself. So you can see that was just adding to the drum kit. Just I wanted to have a little bit more kind of oomph from that crashes and the ride, and so I just blended some samples in just to give that to me. Now, if we take a look at the sends that we've got going on, we've got some snare reverb on the snares, and it looks like we've got it on the tambourine as well. Now, if we just look at what reverb I'm using the fat plates from Relab Development, the LX480 Essentials. So if we just have a listen to the snare top with the reverb on. Yeah, that reverb is adding a lot. And again, it's adding a lot of sustain to the drum. So that reverb is on all of the snares. That's on the top and the bottom, just again to keep it kind of in context of the same room. So I put it on all of the snares, and I've got it on the tambourine as well. Again, because the tambourine is kind of part of my snare sound. It's the ring. So I've just put it on all of them there. And then the second send I've got going on the individual tracks is the dirt. Now the dirt is the devil log. And again, that's just adding some distortion. So if we just play the whole drum kit, and I'm going to ride the devil log return, and you're going to hear what that's doing. So you heard there, it's just adding a little bit of kind of character to the snare drum. And so yeah, again, I went with it. It felt right. It sounded good. Now we've got the drum bus. Let's take a look at what I'm doing on the drum bus. So all of my individual drums are all going to a group, which I'm calling the drum group. And on the drum group, let's look what I've got going on. I've got some EQ, again, doing some filtering, taking out some frequencies that I just don't like. So let's have a look at those frequencies that I'm not liking in the overall drum kit sound. Bit of boxiness. So we got some of those frequencies that I'm just not liking. And then we've got some bottom end that I'm boosting. I'm boosting some 100 hertz on the Pultec and a little bit of 10K. And again, it's just doing a little bit of a smiley face EQ just to kind of, I guess, make the drum sound happy, I guess. Let's have a listen to what that's doing with it on and with it off, and you'll hear what it's doing. Just fattens up the sound. And to be honest with you, you could use any EQ, but the Pultec is known to have kind of a very smooth top end. And because I was kind of really controlling the cymbals earlier with all the EQ and the soothe, just to kind of mellow out the top end, I felt like, well, if you want to mellow out the top end, then use an EQ that's famously known to have a mellow top end. It kind of makes sense to me. So that's why I went with the Pultec, and I boosted only a dB at 10K and a boost at 100 hertz, again a dB, just to add a little bit of oomph and excitement to the drum kit. And then I'm using this great compressor. Again, it's a newer plugin to me. It's Mixland, it's a VAC Attack, and it just sounds nice. I'm only doing probably 1 or 2 dB on this, but if you take a listen with this on and then with it off, you'll hear what it's doing. Again, very subtle, but it's kind of gluing all of the elements in one place together, and it's just adding that kind of stickiness to the drum kit, which I like. And then after that, I've got some excitement, some harmonic saturation. I'm just using the standard decapitator in A mode. Again, probably doing half a dB, if that maybe. Just again, adding some more excitement to the drum kit. Let's have a listen with this on and with it off, and you'll hear what it's doing. Again, not doing very much. You're probably sitting there thinking, what are these plugins doing? But I tend to use, plugins, I try and keep plugins to a minimum. But if I am using a lot of plugins, they won't be doing a lot. And in this case, I am using a little bit more plugins than I may usually would, because I felt like I needed to. But the plugins are doing very minimal stuff. They're not doing lots. Next one is a standard clip. Again, I'm using a clip on the drum bus, and that's just to catch the transients, any kind of overs from the drum kit itself. And to me, this is really important because it enables me to get to a certain volume, as I said earlier, on the track itself. Because if I have transients that are not controlled, it's going to hit the limiter and it's going to, crap out and distort. And so this just enables me to get more perceived loudness, be able to push the limiter to get loud without crapping out the limiter to ruin the mix. So it's one of those kind of things that, I'm doing. And again, 1 or 2 dB max of clipping on this. If we take a look. That's a lie. I'm doing probably 0.3 dB of clipping, but again, it's just little bit by little bit controlling everything. And then I've got some Spectre, again, some saturation, just lifting up some high end. I just felt like this would have been kind of a move towards the end if the drums just felt a bit dull to me in the mix, and I just, you know, there was just something missing, and I just felt like I wanted to have a little bit more brightness. I tend to go for something like an EQ or a saturation like Spectre, just to boost up some high end, just to give me that little bit of kind of flavor in the drum kit that I was looking for. So if we have a listen with that on and with it off, you'll hear what it's doing. Again, not much, but you know, a little goes a long way. And then I've got a ultra maximizer by Waves, just a limiter, again controlling more peaks. I've just got it on the cozy and warm setting. I went with it, it sounded good. You could use any setting that you like, but you'll see that I'm not increasing volume here because the ceiling and the threshold is the same. Again, this is just catching peaks. Now a clipper will just kind of completely cut the peaks. This one, it works slightly different with the peaks. It kind of rounds it off less, so it doesn't cut it, it rounds it off, and it just allows it to be kind of a little bit less kind of crazy, if that makes sense, that clipping sound, because clippers can change the sound a lot. So this one I'm just doing very tiny amounts, and again, just control. It's all about control. Hardly anything. Again, this is set up in my template, so you know, you could argue it doesn't need to be there, maybe not, but you know, it wasn't affecting the sound in a way where it was ruining the sound. It was, to me, adding, and if something's adding, then I go with the flow, you know. That's kind of the way I work. And then I felt like that I had reverb on the snare, but I just felt the whole drum kit in itself, I wanted to have it like put into a different space. And again, this would have been because of the acoustic guitars with the electrics, and just again the vocalist, just the vibe of the track may have needed the drum kit to be in a different place. So I don't always do this move, but on the drum bus I decided just to add some reverb as a send, and the drum reverb that I'm using is again LX480, and it's the drum room preset. And so yeah, let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Yeah, so I know why I would have used that. One of the kind of the mix notes came back saying that they wanted the drums to sound retro, as I said earlier. They wanted it to sound vintage. They wanted it to sound like it was, you know, one person just with a microphone holding it up and going, there's a drum kit. And so by using that reverb, it just allowed that to kind of paint the picture just in a little bit of a better way than the drum recording was. Now, I'm using the snare reverb as a decay of the snare to kind of, in a way, as a glue to the drum kit. And then I'm using the drum bus reverb as, okay, we've glued the snares to make it kind of tail off nicely. Now we're going to glue the whole drum kit to paint the picture for the actual track itself, again, in context with the song. And so that is really doing that a lot, actually. It's adding a lot. It changes the drum sound completely. So that's now basically the whole drum kit. So now let's just take a listen with all the plugins on, as we did at the start of the tutorial, and then take them all off again, and you'll hear the difference on kind of what we achieve with all of that processing. And that's my process for mixing drums. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment. Any questions you got, I will get back to you, I promise. And I'll see you all again next week for another video.